The clock on the wall of the Phoenix Emergency Dispatch Center showed 12:47 a.m. on March 15, 1988. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Nancy Croft adjusted her headset, settling into what should have been another routine night shift in Arizona's desert capital. At 28 years old, Nancy had been a 911 dispatcher for 6 years. Her colleagues often said she had a gift for calming panicked callers, a soothing voice that could guide someone through their worst moments. That night, however, Nancy would receive a call that would lead to her becoming part of a mystery that wouldn't be solved for 32 years. Before we begin the story, write in the comments which city you're from. We're very interested to know where you're watching our video from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. The dispatch center was quieter than usual that March night. The spring tourist season hadn't yet begun, and the desert air carried a chill that kept most people indoors. Nancy's supervisor, Sarah Walsh, was working the overnight shift alongside her. At 26, Sarah was younger than Nancy, but had recently been promoted to shift supervisor. She was known for her attention to detail and her protective attitude toward her team. "It's going to be a slow night," Sarah had mentioned when they'd started their shift at 11 p.m. "Perfect for catching up on paperwork." The relationship between Nancy and Sarah appeared professional and friendly. Co-workers would later recall that Sarah often brought Nancy coffee during long shifts and seemed to admire Nancy's dedication to the job. What no one knew at the time was that Sarah's helpfulness masked something far more complicated. 3 days before that fateful night, on March 12th at 3:15 p.m., 8-year-old Michael Stone had been reported missing from Desert Vista Elementary School. The boy had last been seen leaving the playground during recess. His teacher noticed his absence when the children returned to class. Michael was a quiet child who lived with his grandmother after his parents had died in a car accident 2 years earlier. The Phoenix Police Department had launched an immediate search, but by March 15th, there were still no leads. Detective Ray Torres, the lead investigator on Michael's case, had been working around the clock. At 34, Torres was considered one of the department's rising stars, known for his methodical approach to investigations. The dispatch center's backup recording system, which used magnetic cassette tapes, was routinely maintained by the local telephone company. Frank Milford, a 24-year-old technician, had been assigned to service the Phoenix Dispatch Center. Quiet and competent, Frank was the kind of employee who blended into the background. He'd been working for Mountain Bell Telephone Company for 3 years and had security clearance to access the dispatch center's technical areas. His work orders showed he'd been at the center just the day before Nancy's disappearance, performing what was logged as routine maintenance. At 12:47 a.m., the call came in. The center's automatic logging system recorded the incoming line, though the caller ID showed as blocked. Nancy answered with her standard greeting, but what she heard made her sit up straight in her chair. A child's voice, barely a whisper, spoke just a few words before the line went dead. Sarah, sitting at the supervisor's station, noticed Nancy's sudden change in posture. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked. Nancy removed her headset slowly, her face pale. "I just got a call, a child asking for help. They said someone was coming for them." The protocol for such calls was clear. Nancy should have immediately notified her supervisor and logged the call details. Sarah would then contact the police department. But something about the call deeply affected Nancy. Witnesses would later report that Nancy seemed distracted for the rest of her shift, repeatedly checking the missing persons database on her terminal. At 2:15 a.m., the computer log showed Nancy accessing Michael Stone's missing person report. She read through the details: height, weight, what he was wearing when he disappeared, and the locations that had already been searched. Sarah noticed Nancy's preoccupation. "You're thinking about that call," Sarah observed. Nancy nodded. The voice, it sounded so young. What if it was that missing boy, Michael Stone? Sarah's response would later seem significant. The police are handling that case. We need to stick to our protocols." But Nancy couldn't let it go. She made a note on a piece of paper, writing down 2 words that investigators would later find in her abandoned car. Desert Springs Road. The dispatch center had a rhythm to it, even during quiet nights. Calls came in waves: domestic disputes, medical emergencies, traffic accidents. Between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. was typically the quietest period, what dispatchers called the dead zone. That night was no exception. The other dispatcher on duty would later recall that Nancy seemed increasingly agitated as the night wore on. She kept replaying the backup tape of the call, trying to enhance the audio to hear any background noise that might provide a clue to the caller's location. Frank Milford's presence at the dispatch center the previous day had gone largely unnoticed by the staff. Security footage, reviewed much later, would show him entering the building at 3 p.m. on March 14th with his toolkit and work order. He spent approximately 2 hours in the technical room, supposedly updating the phone system's routing protocols. What investigators wouldn't discover until 2020 was that Frank had installed something else during that visit, a device that could intercept and redirect specific calls. At 4:15 a.m., Nancy made a decision that would seal her fate. She accessed the dispatch center's geographic information system and pulled up a map of the Desert Springs Road area. It was a remote stretch of highway about 45 minutes northeast of Phoenix, known for its abandoned mining sites. The Copper Crown Mine, closed since 1962, was marked on the map. Nancy printed the map and folded it carefully, placing it in her purse. Sarah watched all of this from her supervisor's station. "Nancy, what are you doing?" she asked. Nancy's response was measured but determined. "I keep thinking about that voice. What if that child is out there right now, waiting for help? The call came from somewhere, and Desert Springs Road keeps coming up in the Michael Stone case file." Sarah stood up and walked over to Nancy's station. "You can't just leave. Your shift doesn't end until 6. But Nancy was already gathering her things. "I'll just drive out there and look around. I'll be back before the shift ends." What happened next would become crucial to understanding the full picture, though its significance wouldn't be recognized for decades. Sarah didn't immediately report Nancy's unauthorized departure. Instead, she waited. The security system logged Nancy's badge scanning at the exit at 4:30 a.m. Sarah would later claim she expected Nancy to return quickly and didn't want to get her in trouble. But the dispatch center's phone records would eventually reveal something else. At 4:35 a.m., Sarah made an outgoing call to a number that belonged to Frank Milford's pager. Nancy's 1985 Honda Civic was found at 7:45 a.m. by a state trooper conducting routine patrol on Highway 87. The car was parked on the shoulder, the driver's door closed, but unlocked. Inside, investigators found Nancy's dispatcher headset on the passenger seat and her purse on the floor. The printed map was still folded in her purse, with Desert Springs Road circled in pen. Her pager, which all dispatchers were required to carry, was also in the car, showing one final message received at 5:20 a.m., a series of numbers that initially seemed random, but would later prove to be geographic coordinates. The investigation into Nancy's disappearance began immediately. Detective Torres, already exhausted from the Michael Stone case, was assigned to lead this investigation as well. The connection seemed obvious. Nancy had received a call that might have been from Michael, and now she was missing too. Torres interviewed everyone who had been at the dispatch center that night. Sarah Walsh was particularly helpful, providing detailed timeline information and expressing deep concern for her colleague. Nancy was dedicated, maybe too dedicated, Sarah told investigators. She took every call personally, especially ones involving children. Frank Milford was also interviewed, but only as part of the routine questioning of everyone who had been at the dispatch center in the previous week. He appeared cooperative, explaining that his work on March 14th had been routine maintenance, updating software protocols to improve call routing efficiency. He provided his work order and timesheet, showing he had completed the job and left by 5 p.m. When asked about his whereabouts on the night of March 15th, Frank said he had been home alone, working on electronics projects in his garage. A hobby, he explained. The search for Nancy expanded rapidly. Helicopters scanned the desert around Highway 87. Search teams combed through the area around Desert Springs Road. The abandoned Copper Crown mine was checked, but the main shaft had been sealed years earlier for safety. After 2 weeks with no sign of Nancy or Michael, the case began to grow cold. The FBI was brought in, given the possibility that this involved a child abduction across state lines. But even with federal resources, no new leads emerged. Sarah Walsh requested a transfer to a different shift after Nancy's disappearance, saying it was too difficult to work in the same space where her friend had last been seen. She was granted the transfer and moved to the day shift. Years later, co-workers would remember that Sarah seemed to struggle with Nancy's disappearance, often becoming emotional when Nancy's name was mentioned. What appeared to be grief, however, would eventually be understood very differently. The investigation into Nancy Croft's disappearance initially focused on the most obvious connection, the mysterious call she had received from what she believed was Michael Stone. Detective Torres worked 18-hour days, coordinating search efforts across the desert terrain surrounding Phoenix. The theory was straightforward. Nancy had somehow figured out where Michael was being held and had gone to help him, walking into danger. But as weeks turned into months, the trail grew cold. The dispatch center's backup tapes from that night became a crucial piece of evidence. The recording of the call Nancy received at 12:47 a.m. was played repeatedly, analyzed by audio experts. The child's voice was faint, saying only a few words. "Help me? He's coming for me." But there was something else on the tape, something that wouldn't be properly identified until decades later. A second voice in the background, barely audible, that seemed to be coaching the child on what to say. Frank Milford's name came up several times during the investigation, but never as a serious suspect. His work at the dispatch center was verified as legitimate, and Mountain Bell Telephone Company confirmed he was one of their most reliable technicians. When investigators asked him about any unusual activity at the dispatch center, Frank mentioned that he had noticed some irregularities in the phone system's logs, but attributed them to normal technical glitches. He even offered to help the police understand the technical aspects of how the emergency call system worked, an offer that Detective Torres gratefully accepted. Sarah Walsh became an unofficial liaison between the dispatch center and the investigation. She compiled all of Nancy's work records, her call logs, and any notes she had made. Sarah pointed out patterns in Nancy's behavior leading up to her disappearance. She had been researching missing children cases on her breaks, Sarah told investigators. Not just Michael Stone, but others too. I think she felt a personal responsibility to help. This information led investigators to consider whether Nancy might have been targeted because of her interest in these cases. The search area expanded to include all the abandoned mines in the region. Arizona's mining history had left hundreds of old shafts and tunnels scattered across the desert. Each one had to be checked, a dangerous and time-consuming process. The Copper Crown mine, which Nancy had circled on her map, was examined more thoroughly. The main entrance had been sealed with concrete in 1975, but investigators discovered there were other ways into the mine, ventilation shafts and secondary entrances that weren't on official surveys. 4 months after Nancy's disappearance, a potential breakthrough emerged. A truck driver reported seeing a Honda Civic matching Nancy's car description on a remote service road near Desert Springs on the morning of March 15th. He remembered it because it seemed out of place, a small city car on a road typically used only by mining company vehicles. But when investigators searched the area again, they found no new evidence. Sarah Walsh's behavior during this period would later be scrutinized. She had started dating someone new, she told coworkers, though she was oddly secretive about the relationship. She requested specific schedule changes that seemed unusual, always wanting to work shifts that ended before 10 p.m., never wanting to work alone. When asked about these preferences, she said Nancy's disappearance had made her more cautious about personal safety. The pages missing from the dispatch logbook became another puzzle. 3 pages covering the period from March 12th to March 14th had been torn out. Sarah was the one who discovered and reported the missing pages, suggesting that someone might have removed them to cover up evidence about the calls received regarding Michael Stone. This led investigators to suspect that someone inside the dispatch center might have been involved, but there was no evidence pointing to any specific person. Frank Milford left Mountain Bell Telephone Company 6 months after Nancy's disappearance, citing better opportunities elsewhere. He moved to California, where he started his own electronics repair business. Before leaving, he met with Detective Torres one final time, offering to remain available if they needed any technical consultations about the phone systems. Torres noted that Frank seemed genuinely interested in helping solve the case. A year passed with no new developments. Michael Stone's grandmother passed away, never knowing what had happened to her grandson. Nancy's family held a memorial service, though without a body, there was no real closure. Her daughter, only 5 years old when Nancy disappeared, was raised by Nancy's parents. The little girl would grow up to become an advocate for dispatcher safety, inspired by her mother's dedication to helping others. The case files were reviewed annually, but no new leads emerged. Detective Torres was promoted and eventually moved to the Homicide Division. He kept Nancy's file on his desk, occasionally pulling it out to review the evidence. The cassette tape of that final call was transferred to digital format to preserve it. Each time he listened to it, Torres felt like he was missing something obvious. In 1995, 7 years after the disappearances, there was a brief moment of hope. Construction workers building a new highway discovered human remains in the desert. The location was within the search area from 1988. But DNA testing, still relatively new at the time, revealed the remains were much older, from the 1960s. The discovery did, however, lead to a more detailed survey of the area's abandoned mines using new ground-penetrating radar technology. Sarah Walsh had moved up in her career, becoming a dispatch center manager in Tucson. She was respected for her emphasis on safety protocols and her insistence on never allowing dispatchers to investigate calls on their own. She would often tell the story of Nancy Croft as a cautionary tale. She was brave, but she should have waited for police backup, Sarah would say. We can't save everyone by ourselves. The phone records from March 1988 were digitized in 2001 as part of a broader effort to preserve old case evidence. During this process, a technician noticed an anomaly. There were several calls to the dispatch center on March 14th that seemed to originate from within the building itself. This was technically impossible with the system configuration at the time, unless someone had modified the equipment. This discovery led to a renewed interest in everyone who had technical access to the dispatch center. Frank Milford, now running a successful electronics business in San Diego, was interviewed again. He explained that internal calls could happen if there was a wiring fault, something he claimed to have fixed during his March 14th maintenance visit. He provided detailed technical explanations that satisfied the investigators. His business was thriving, he had no criminal record, and he seemed to have built a normal life in California. By 2010, the case had become cold again. Nancy Croft and Michael Stone were listed among Arizona's unsolved disappearances. True crime podcasts occasionally covered the story, focusing on the mystery of the whispered call and Nancy's decision to investigate alone. Theories ranged from serial killer involvement to Nancy accidentally driving off the road in an unfamiliar area. But without new evidence, these remained just theories. The breakthrough that would finally solve the case came from an unexpected source. In 2019, Nancy's daughter, now an adult, received her grandmother's effects after she passed away. Among them was a box of Nancy's belongings that had been returned to the family after the initial investigation. Inside was Nancy's work notebook, which had been overlooked because it mostly contained routine notes about calls and schedules. But Nancy's daughter, who worked in IT, noticed something others had missed. Nancy had written a series of numbers in the margins of various pages, numbers that looked like phone extensions or codes. When she researched the dispatch center's old phone system, she discovered these weren't extensions at all. They were routing codes that could be used to redirect calls. This suggested Nancy had discovered something about the phone system that concerned her. This discovery led Nancy's daughter to reach out to a friend who specialized in analyzing old telecommunications systems. Together, they obtained permission to access the archived phone company records from 1988. Using modern AI analysis tools, they began to piece together the call patterns from the days leading up to Nancy's disappearance. What they found was shocking. The AI identified that several calls had been manipulated, rerouted through the dispatch center in a way that would only be possible if someone had installed unauthorized equipment. The pattern suggested someone was using the dispatch center's systems to make untraceable calls. Even more disturbing, the analysis revealed that the emergency call Nancy received at 12:47 a.m. had actually originated from inside the dispatch center building. The revelation that the emergency call had originated from inside the dispatch center building changed everything. Nancy's daughter immediately contacted the Phoenix Police Department's cold case unit presenting the telecommunications analysis. Detective Maria Santos, who had inherited the case files, recognized the significance immediately. If the call came from inside the building, then someone at the dispatch center that night had orchestrated Nancy's disappearance. The investigation team began re-examining every person who had been in the building on March 15, 1988. The security logs showed only 3 people had badge access that night: Nancy Croft, Sarah Walsh, and a maintenance worker who had left at 11:30 p.m. But the new analysis revealed something else. The unauthorized equipment that had been installed could have allowed someone to access the building's phone system remotely, as long as they had a physical device planted inside. The focus turned to Frank Milford's maintenance visit on March 14th. Using modern technology, investigators analyzed the old security footage that had been digitized years earlier. Enhancement software revealed details that hadn't been visible before. Frank could be seen carrying equipment that didn't match the standard Mountain Bell toolkit. More significantly, he made multiple trips to areas of the building that weren't related to his stated work order. In 2020, the investigation team decided to use a new tool: genetic genealogy. DNA had been collected from Nancy's car in 1988, including samples from the passenger seat that didn't match Nancy. This DNA had never been identified. Now, using the same techniques that had solved other cold cases, they uploaded the DNA profile to genealogical databases. Within months, they had a match. A distant cousin of Frank Milford had submitted their DNA for ancestry research. With this lead, Detective Santos obtained a warrant for Frank's DNA. Now 56 years old and still living in California, Frank voluntarily provided a sample, maintaining his innocence. He seemed confident, even helpful, explaining that of course his DNA might be in Nancy's car since he had helped many dispatch center employees with their personal electronics over the years. But the DNA told a different story. It was found on Nancy's pager, which she had only received 2 weeks before her disappearance after Frank's last official visit to the dispatch center. The investigation team knew they needed more. They returned to Sarah Walsh, now 68, and retired in Tucson. When informed about the new developments, Sarah's reaction was unexpected. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she asked, "Have you found them yet? Nancy and the boy?" When told they were still searching, Sarah's composure began to crack. "I've carried this for 32 years, she said quietly. What Sarah revealed over the next several hours fundamentally changed the understanding of the case. She and Frank had been in a relationship, a secret one that had begun months before Nancy's disappearance. Frank had initially approached Sarah for information about the dispatch center's systems, claiming he was working on improvements. Sarah, flattered by the attention from the younger technician, had begun meeting him outside of work. But Frank's interest in Sarah wasn't romantic. It was strategic. He had been using the dispatch center's systems for something far darker. The investigation into Michael Stone's disappearance had gotten too close to something Frank needed to keep hidden. He had convinced Sarah that Michael had been taken by dangerous people who would kill them both if their operation was exposed. The only solution, Frank had told her, was to misdirect the investigation. Sarah admitted to making the fake emergency call at 12:47 a.m. using the equipment Frank had installed. She had whispered the words herself, disguising her voice to sound like a child. The plan was simple. Nancy would hear the call, become concerned, and report it to the police, who would then search in the wrong direction. But Nancy had done something unexpected. She had decided to investigate herself. "I tried to stop her," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I told her to follow protocol, to let the police handle it. But Nancy was always like that. She couldn't ignore a child in danger." When Nancy left the dispatch center, Sarah had paged Frank immediately. He said he would handle it, make sure Nancy didn't find anything. He promised no one would be hurt. The coordinates on Nancy's pager, Sarah revealed, had been sent by Frank. He had lured Nancy to a specific location with the promise of information about Michael. Sarah claimed she didn't know what happened next, only that Nancy never returned. Frank had told her there had been an accident, that Nancy had fallen into an old mine shaft while searching the area. By then, Sarah felt trapped, complicit in a cover-up that had gone tragically wrong. The complete picture was even more disturbing. Frank Milford, investigators discovered, had been part of a ring that exploited vulnerable children. Michael Stone had witnessed something he shouldn't have at a location Frank frequented. The boy's disappearance had been Frank's attempt to silence a potential witness. The dispatch center's communication systems had been perfect for coordinating illegal activities without leaving traces. Armed with Sarah's confession and new evidence, police arrested Frank Milford in California. Faced with the mounting evidence, Frank's carefully constructed life began to unravel. His electronics business was searched, revealing encrypted files that investigators were able to decode. Among them were records that led to a storage unit in Arizona that Frank had maintained under a false name for over 3 decades. At the storage unit, investigators found items that had belonged to Michael Stone: his backpack, a distinctive watch his grandmother had given him, and, heartbreakingly, a school library book he had checked out the day before his disappearance. There were also items connected to Nancy, her service weapon, which she had been carrying despite being off duty, and her badge, which she always kept in her purse. The search for Nancy and Michael's remains intensified. Using Frank's own records decoded from his encrypted files, investigators identified several locations he had frequented in 1988. Ground-penetrating radar was deployed at the Copper Crown mine once again, this time focusing on ventilation shafts that had been overlooked in the original search. The technology had improved dramatically since the 1990s, and this time it detected anomalies deep within the mine system. The recovery operation was delicate and dangerous. The mine shafts had deteriorated over the decades, making them unstable. Specialized teams worked for days to safely access the location. When they finally reached the site, they found what they had been searching for 32 years, the remains of both Nancy Croft and Michael Stone. Forensic analysis confirmed their identities through dental records and DNA. The evidence showed that Nancy had indeed found Michael, or rather, Frank had used the boy as bait to lure Nancy to the mine. The exact circumstances of their deaths would never be fully known, but investigators believed Frank had trapped them in the mine shaft, sealing one of the ventilation exits to prevent escape. It was a cruel and calculated act that ensured they would never be found through conventional searching. Frank Milford was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and numerous other crimes related to his exploitation ring. During his trial, the full extent of his manipulation became clear. He had identified Sarah as someone he could control, someone whose position gave him access to information about police investigations. He had played on her emotions, making her believe she was protecting him from dangerous criminals, when in fact she was enabling his crimes. Sarah Walsh was charged as an accessory after the fact. Her lawyer argued that she had been manipulated and threatened by Frank, but the prosecution maintained that she had multiple opportunities to come forward over the decades. The fact that she had built her career on the tragedy, using Nancy's story as a cautionary tale while knowing the truth, particularly damaged her defense. The trial revealed one final heartbreaking detail. Analysis of the dispatch center's tapes with modern audio equipment revealed that Michael Stone had actually managed to make a real emergency call earlier that day, around 8 p.m. on March 14th. But Frank had intercepted it using his equipment, preventing it from reaching any dispatcher. If that call had gone through, both Michael and Nancy might have been saved. In 2021, Frank Milford was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Now 57 years old, he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. During sentencing, he showed no remorse, maintaining that Sarah had misunderstood their relationship and that the deaths were accidental. The judge dismissed these claims, noting the calculated nature of his crimes. Sarah Walsh pleaded guilty to lesser charges and was sentenced to 10 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 5. Her age and cooperation with the investigation were factors in the sentencing. She expressed deep remorse, though Nancy's family found it difficult to forgive someone who had lived with the knowledge of what happened for over 3 decades. The impact of the case's resolution rippled through multiple communities. The dispatch center implemented new security protocols, including restrictions on technical access and regular audits of communication systems. Nancy's daughter successfully lobbied for Nancy's Law, which required emergency dispatchers to have GPS tracking when responding to calls and prohibited solo responses to potential crime scenes. Michael Stone's case led to changes in how missing children investigations were handled, particularly regarding the first crucial hours after a disappearance. The fact that his emergency call had been intercepted highlighted vulnerabilities in emergency response systems that needed to be addressed. The Copper Crown mine was permanently sealed after the recovery operation. A memorial was erected nearby, honoring both Nancy Croft and Michael Stone. The inscription read, "In memory of those who answered the call for help and those who called. May their courage never be forgotten." Every year on March 15th, dispatchers across Arizona observe a moment of silence at 12:47 a.m. The case became a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities in emergency response systems and the dangers of unchecked access to critical infrastructure. It also highlighted how advancing technology could solve cases that seemed impossible to crack. The AI analysis that revealed the call patterns and the DNA genealogy that identified Frank were tools that didn't exist in 1988. Nancy Croft was posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor for her attempt to save Michael Stone. Her daughter accepted the award, speaking about how her mother's dedication to helping others had ultimately cost her life, but had also inspired a new generation of emergency responders to take safety seriously while maintaining their commitment to service. The story of Nancy Croft and Michael Stone serves as a reminder that some people will risk everything to help a stranger in danger. Nancy heard a child's cry for help and couldn't ignore it, even though it led her into a trap. Her bravery, while tragic in its outcome, exemplified the very best of what emergency responders represent: the willingness to be the voice of calm in chaos and the helping hand in darkness. As for Frank Milford, investigations into his past revealed he had likely been involved in other crimes that remained unsolved. His storage unit contained items that couldn't be immediately identified, but suggested other victims. These investigations continue, with cold case units across the Southwest reviewing unsolved disappearances from the 1980s and 1990s. The resolution of the case brought different reactions from those involved. Detective Ray Torres, now retired, expressed mixed emotions. He had always suspected the answer lay within the dispatch center, but hadn't been able to prove it with the technology available at the time. He attended the memorial service for Nancy and Michael, finally able to provide the closure he couldn't give their families decades earlier. The dispatch center where it all happened was eventually demolished and rebuilt. But those who work there say that every dispatcher knows Nancy's story. Not the false version Sarah had told for years, but the true one. She became a symbol of both the nobility and the danger of their profession. Training now includes Nancy's case as an example of why protocols exist and why dispatchers must balance their desire to help with their own safety. The families of Nancy Croft and Michael Stone found some peace in finally knowing what had happened. Nancy's daughter established a scholarship fund for aspiring emergency dispatchers, ensuring her mother's legacy would continue through others who chose to serve. Michael's extended family created a foundation focused on child safety and improving emergency response systems for missing children. The case also sparked discussions about the psychological manipulation involved. Frank's ability to control Sarah for decades, making her complicit in covering up murders while she built a career on promoting safety, showed how predators could exploit positions of trust. Training for emergency services now includes recognizing signs of manipulation and coercion. In his prison cell, Frank Milford maintains a small electronics workshop where he repairs radios for other inmates. Guards report he never speaks about his crimes, acting as if he's merely a technician wrongly convicted. This denial extends to refusing to reveal if there were other victims, taking those secrets with him into imprisonment. Sarah Walsh was released on parole in 2026 after serving 5 years. She moved to a small town in New Mexico where no one knew her story. She volunteers at a local church seeking redemption for her role in the tragedy. She has never given interviews about the case, saying she doesn't deserve to profit from her participation in such horror. The technology that solved the case continues to advance. The AI systems that detected the call pattern anomalies are now standard tools in cold case investigations. DNA genealogy has solved hundreds of cases since Nancy and Michael's murders were resolved. Each success brings hope to families still waiting for answers about their missing loved ones. The final chapter of this story was written in 2024 when a time capsule at the old dispatch center site was opened. Inside was a photo of all the dispatchers from 1988, including Nancy Croft. She stood in the middle, smiling, wearing her headset. A note with the photo, written by a colleague, read, "Nancy always said every call mattered. She proved it with her life." The story of Nancy Croft and Michael Stone reminds us that justice can be delayed but not denied. It took 32 years, advancing technology, and the persistent efforts of Nancy's daughter to uncover the truth. Their case stands as testament to the fact that someone always remembers, someone always searches, and eventually someone finds the truth.